Few would have expected that an elderly woman with a raspy voice, thick glasses, and a sharp sense of humor would become one of the most talked about figures in the world of death and the afterlife. Sylvia Browne wasn't a scientist, nor a doctor, but she dared to speak aloud about what many medical professionals only whispered: what people truly see in their final moments of life. As a psychic and best-selling author, she shared visions reported by the dying, visions of light, departed loved ones, and a peace so profound it defied explanation. These weren't hallucinations, she insisted. They were glimpses of a transition, of the soul preparing to leave. And what made her voice so compelling was not just the mysticism, but how eerily her descriptions mirrored the stories shared by those who stood at death's door and came back. Sylvia Browne was one of the most controversial and influential spiritual figures of the late 20th and early 21st century. Born in 1936 in Kansas City, Missouri, she claimed to have experienced psychic visions from the age of 3. While many dismissed such stories as childhood imagination, Sylvia never wavered. She spent decades developing what she described as a deep connection with the other side, a spiritual dimension where souls exist beyond death. Over time, she became not only a prolific author, but also a widely recognized voice on television, appearing regularly on shows like The Montel Williams Show, where she offered readings, predictions, and most notably, comforting messages from those who had passed on. Despite skepticism from scientists and rationalists, Browne's message resonated with millions who found in her a kind of spiritual translator, someone who claimed to understand what happens when the physical body dies and the soul begins its journey. Far from presenting herself as a mystical guru, Sylvia was often blunt, even humorous, about her role. She didn't wear flowing robes or use complex rituals. Her approach was systematic. In her best-selling books like Life on the Other Side and The Other Side and Back, she carefully laid out what she called the stages of spiritual transition. According to her, death was not an end, but a step in a long cycle of learning, growth, and return. She described a highly structured afterlife, a place she called the other side, complete with buildings, animals, colors more vivid than on Earth, and even a governing spiritual council. Her descriptions were precise, consistent, and repeated across multiple books and interviews, suggesting not fantasy, but a worldview she sincerely believed, and one she claimed came from direct communication with spirits. What truly set Sylvia apart, however, was her detailed description of what occurs in the final moments of life. In her work, she claimed that dying individuals often perceive loving presences in the room, feel drawn toward a glowing tunnel, or hear the voices of relatives who had already passed on. Many of these accounts sounded eerily similar to the growing body of reports from people who had survived near-death experiences, NDEs. Sylvia noted that it didn't matter where people lived, what religion they followed, or whether they believed in the afterlife at all. Again and again, the same imagery surfaced: radiant light, overwhelming peace, and the feeling of being lifted or guided. These patterns, she argued, were too consistent to be dismissed as hallucination. Browne insisted that what many in the medical field described as end-of-life delirium or terminal lucidity was in fact the soul beginning its departure. The confusion, she said, wasn't due to a failing brain, but the overlap between physical and spiritual awareness. In the moments before death, according to her teachings, the veil between the worlds becomes thinner. People begin to see beyond the physical. Some talk to deceased loved ones, others smile at unseen figures, and still others seem to know the exact moment their passing will occur. Sylvia was not alone in pointing this out, but she was one of the few who spoke about it so openly for decades. Her words brought enormous comfort to the families of the dying. When medical professionals could offer only clinical explanations or emotional support, Sylvia offered meaning. Her ability to describe the unseen brought solace to people who felt helpless in the face of death. She reminded them that their loved ones were not simply vanishing into nothingness. They were being welcomed home. People would write to her, often years after a reading, to say how much peace her words had brought. For many, especially those who had no religious background, Sylvia filled a spiritual void that no one else dared to approach. She was not trying to convert anyone or ask for blind faith. Instead, She shared what she believed was the truth about the final passage of life, and millions believed her, not because she proved it scientifically, but because her words echoed what so many people had already witnessed with their own eyes and hearts. While her work sparked controversy and criticism from skeptics, Brown remained confident in her insights until her death. In her decades of work, Sylvia Browne became known not only for her descriptions of the afterlife, but also for cataloging what she called universal patterns in the moments before death. These were recurring images and experiences she claimed were reported time and time again, not just by the dying, but by those who returned from near-death experiences, and by families who witnessed final moments that defied all rational explanation. Brown was convinced that these patterns revealed something far deeper than the mind's final flickers. They were glimpses of the soul's transition, too consistent and too vivid to be dismissed as imagination. Among the most frequently described images was the presence of a radiant, welcoming light. Unlike the harsh glow of medical equipment or fluorescent bulbs, this light was described as warm, loving, and deeply familiar, like being wrapped in a comforting embrace. People nearing death often fixated on something no one else could see, their eyes focused on a specific point in the room, as if they were recognizing someone. Many smiled, some even called out names of parents, siblings, spouses, and even children who had died before them. According to Brown, these were not hallucinations but visitations. The deceased weren't imagined, they were coming to escort the soul home. One of the most poignant elements in Sylvia's accounts was the repeated description of bridges. Across cultures and religions, dying individuals mentioned crossing a bridge or standing at the edge of one. Brown interpreted this symbol as the soul's awareness of a transition, a literal crossing between worlds. Sometimes the bridge appeared as golden or transparent. Other times it stretched into a landscape that defied earthly geography, filled with impossible beauty. Yet the emotional tone was always the same: peace, welcome, and the absence of fear. For Sylvia, these shared visions weren't coincidence. They were evidence of a spiritual architecture that greeted every soul, regardless of belief or background. Another recurring theme was sound. Brown often spoke of dying people hearing music, sometimes choral, sometimes instrumental, but always otherworldly. Others reported hearing voices, not in a frightening or chaotic way, but gentle and guiding. These voices, according to Sylvia, belonged to spiritual guides, beings assigned to help each soul make the journey safely. Families sometimes heard their loved ones whispering or responding to these unseen voices in their final hours. To medical staff, it could be dismissed as a side effect of medication or brain failure. But to Brown and countless relatives, it felt like something sacred was unfolding. What made Sylvia's descriptions so compelling was how often they matched real-world accounts. People who had never heard of her and had no interest in spirituality reported eerily similar experiences. A grandfather in hospice suddenly sat up and smiled at a corner of the room, saying, "She's here." A terminally ill woman reached for invisible hands, tears running down her cheeks as she whispered her mother's name. In another case, a man who had been unconscious for days suddenly opened his eyes, looked upward, and said, "They're calling me." These stories, collected by nurses, caregivers, and family members, echoed what Brown had been saying for years. She argued that hallucinations tend to be chaotic, disjointed, or influenced by cultural content. But the visions reported near death were remarkably consistent across geography, religion, and medical condition. Children described the same tunnels of light as elderly patients. Atheists recounted the same reunions as the deeply faithful. These weren't random mental firings, they followed a pattern. Brown insisted that this pattern pointed to something real, something that science had not yet learned how to measure. The emotional impact on families was profound. In the midst of grief and uncertainty, witnessing their loved ones smile, reach out, or speak with those who had passed gave many a sense of peace they hadn't expected. It was as if a part of them understood that death wasn't the end. For some, it brought closure. For others, it awakened a belief they never thought they'd embrace. Brown's work offered them a language and a framework to understand these moments. Not as tricks of the brain, but as sacred farewells guided by something greater. Throughout her life, Sylvia Brown was adamant. What the dying experience in their final moments is not a hallucination, not a dream, and certainly not a meaningless flicker of a dying brain. In her books and lectures, she described death as a deliberate, structured, and even sacred process, something that followed its own internal laws, far beyond the reach of our current scientific understanding. She referred to this as the displacement of the soul, or the soul's release, a process she claimed to have witnessed through spiritual insight and conversations with those on the other side. According to Sylvia, when death approaches, the soul begins to loosen its connection to the body. This isn't a sudden snap, she explained, but a gradual process that can begin hours or even days before the physical body actually dies. During this time, the person may drift in and out of awareness, not because of medication or fading consciousness, but because the soul is beginning to function in both dimensions at once. Sylvia described this stage as a kind of overlap, where the soul is half in and half out. That's why many dying people appear to talk to invisible presences or seem deeply aware of things that the living can't perceive. One of the key distinctions Brown made was between hallucinations, dreams, and what she called astral transition. Hallucinations, she said, are disordered, frightening, and unpredictable. Dreams can be meaningful, but they're shaped by memory and emotion. But in astral transition, the process of dying is neither. It is calm, clear, and often filled with beauty. The dying don't report jumbled nonsense or terrifying images. Instead, they describe walking through gardens, seeing brilliant light, hearing voices that feel deeply familiar, and above all, feeling peaceful. Sylvia pointed out that this consistency, across ages, religions, and beliefs, was strong evidence that something more was happening. Central to her explanation were what she called spiritual escorts or guides. According to Brown, every soul is met at the time of death by at least one spiritual companion, often a deceased relative, a beloved friend, or a being who has accompanied the soul through many lifetimes. These escorts don't just appear, they interact. They reassure, comfort, and help the soul step away from its earthly vessel. Sylvia claimed that these guides begin to make themselves known even before physical death, which explains why many dying individuals seem to reach for someone no one else can see. In her view, the presence of these guides is one of the most important signs that what is happening is not internal chaos, but an organized transition. Another striking belief she held was that the soul remains highly aware of what is going on around it, even after it leaves the body. She emphasized that dying people, or those who have clinically died and returned, often describe overhearing conversations that took place while they were unconscious. They report knowing who was in the room, what was said, and even the emotional state of their loved ones. For Sylvia, this was a critical point. If consciousness were merely a product of the brain, such experiences should be impossible. And yet, again and again, people returned from near-death states with specific knowledge they couldn't have known unless something of their awareness had persisted outside the body. She pointed to numerous accounts in which patients who had technically died were later able to describe events in the room with stunning accuracy. In one case, a man in a coma described the precise jewelry his daughter had worn while sitting by his bed, jewelry she had never worn before, thinking it might bring him luck. In another, a woman who had suffered cardiac arrest spoke of seeing her family weeping from above and said she felt overwhelming love, not fear. These stories mirrored the pattern Sylvia had spoken of for decades. A consciousness that lifts out, watches, and then either continues or returns. Perhaps most moving were the moments in which dying people demonstrated an uncanny awareness of others' presence. Families have shared countless stories of their loved ones, seemingly unconscious, squeezing a hand, shedding a single tear, or smiling just as someone entered the room. Brown believed this was further proof that the soul was still present and aware, even when the body had little strength left. To her, these were not coincidences, but signs that the connection between souls is far more profound and enduring than we realize. For Sylvia, the conclusion was clear. The dying do not hallucinate, they awaken. The process is not the collapse of the mind, but the opening of the spirit. And in that opening, what they see, feel, and hear is not fantasy, It is the beginning of something real, vast, and deeply personal. She may not have had lab results or clinical trials to support her claims, but she had story after story, experience after experience, all painting the same picture. To dismiss them all as meaningless, she said, would be to close our eyes to one of the most mysterious and beautiful truths of our existence. For millions of people around the world, Sylvia Browne's words have brought something far more precious than mere fascination. They've brought comfort. In a world where death is often treated as a taboo, a cold clinical event, or a terrifying mystery, Sylvia offered something radically different. The idea that death is not an end, but a return. Her descriptions of what the soul experiences in its final moments gave people a language for something they had long felt but couldn't explain. When loved ones pass away, and their last words or final expressions seem to hint at something greater, Sylvia's teachings help make sense of it. For grieving families, this is more than belief. It's a lifeline. It's the reassurance that what they witnessed wasn't a glitch in the brain, but the soul reaching beyond. The real power of Sylvia's message lies in how universal these deathbed visions are. The patterns she described, light, presence, peace, reunions, have surfaced in reports across every continent, across every culture and religion. Whether it's a Christian in the American Midwest, a Buddhist in Southeast Asia, or someone with no religious background at all, the same images appear again and again. People on the brink of death describe seeing loved ones who have passed, hearing voices calling them, or moving toward an all-encompassing light. This isn't doctrine. It's not dogma. It's experience. And that's why Sylvia insisted this wasn't just about faith. It was about a spiritual reality that crosses all boundaries. In a time when we often rely on science to validate what's real, Brown's perspective challenges us to look at something deeper. These visions, she argued, aren't just psychological responses to fear or brain failure. They're evidence of the soul's awareness beyond the body, glimpses of a realm we've been conditioned to ignore. The consistency of these experiences, the emotional clarity they bring, and the sense of love and peace they evoke point to a profound truth. That there may be a dimension of existence beyond this one, and it reveals itself at the moment we call death. For the living, that truth changes everything. If death is not the annihilation of the self, but a transition, then how we relate to it, and to those who are dying, must change too. Instead of seeing the final days of life as a time of fear or silence, they become a sacred passage. We begin to listen more closely to the words of the dying, to notice the expressions on their faces, the way they sometimes seem to be looking at something or someone just beyond our view. Sylvia taught that these moments are opportunities, not just to grieve, but to witness, to honor what is happening, even if we can't fully explain it. This shift in perception also invites us to reconsider our own relationship with mortality. If what Sylvia described is even partly true, then death loses some of its terror. It becomes not a fall into darkness, but a step into light. And that knowledge, or even the possibility of it, can help people live with more openness, more peace, and less fear. For those facing terminal illness, or for families preparing to say goodbye, Sylvia's insights offer a different lens. A way to understand that something meaningful, perhaps even beautiful, is unfolding beneath the surface. Her work doesn't claim to erase grief, nor does it dismiss the pain of loss, but it reframes the experience. It says, yes, they're gone from this world, but not from existence. Yes, the room may feel empty, but it's not without presence. This idea has helped millions cope, find closure, and even experience a sense of awe in the midst of sorrow. It's not about denying death. It's about transforming our understanding of it. In the end, what Sylvia Browne offered was not proof in the scientific sense, but a body of stories, experiences, and teachings that resonate deeply with what people around the world have already felt in their hearts. Her voice, often met with criticism and skepticism, persisted because it gave form to something quietly known. And perhaps that's the point. Maybe we don't need to wait for absolute proof. Maybe the pattern itself, the shared stories of peace, of reunion, of radiant light, is the evidence. And maybe, just maybe, we are closer to understanding what comes next than we ever imagined. Have you ever been with someone in their last moments? Did you notice anything unusual at that moment? Share it in the comments. Perhaps it is your story that will help other people to be less afraid of what will affect us sooner or later. Dear friends, thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like it and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.